At the back end of 2025, we got the first scientific study looking at Hyrox. So today I'm going to save you time and go through the study, tell you exactly what it found, what you need to know, and how it's going to affect your training. Okay, so this is the study that I'm talking to. As you can see, it's the first scientific study on Hyrox specifically. And there's a couple of things we need to go through before we get into the results, because this is the thing that can lead people astray when looking at research. Those of you who went to uni in this field will probably know what I'm talking about here. You can sometimes see a headline of research and think, oh my God, there's this huge finding, but then sometimes you'll see that the participant or demographic they used don't necessarily tell you how it's going to apply to most people. For example, a lot of fitness-based studies are done on untrained individuals, and if you've been to the gym, you might notice you get gains really quickly. We call these newbie gains. And these untrained individuals can see the newbie gains, which can sometimes skew the data a little bit and make it slightly less reliable because you want to see how it is on trained individuals. So that's an example. So with that in mind, it's worth noting here that the participants for this study were small in terms of how many of them there were. There was only 11 people. There was more men than women, but they were recreational Hyrox athletes who have done one official competition before. So they should have had at least a bit of that initial adaptation. So from that point of view, there's obviously some use to this study, and obviously 11 is not a lot of people, but there's more people than that in a Hyrox wave. But at least we know that they're not complete newbies who have gone from nothing training like this to Hyrox. They've done a Hyrox before. Now, we need to know what they did. So what this study did was that they essentially told these people to do a Hyrox sim as fast as they can. While they're doing that, they measured a couple of things. Now, one of the things they measured was maximum heart rate, obviously percentage of heart rate max, average heart rate. Another thing they measured was blood lactate, which is a really good thing to know, because obviously if you've done a Hyrox, you'll know there's a lot of lactate being developed at certain points in the race. And they also measured their perceived exertion, so RPE, okay? One thing that's noted, all the weights they did in their sim were open for their gender, and the runs were done on a curved treadmill, which is something to take into account because I find I perform a little bit better when I'm not running on a curved treadmill. But some people, it's the opposite, and obviously it can depend on which brand of treadmill you use. Obviously it says here which brand they use, but that is something to take in mind. But we're not really looking at how fast they did it, we're looking at the physiological responses to it. So moving on to that, when it comes to the results, the first thing, you should all know this anyway, right? The running was significantly longer than the times completed at the exercise stations. We know that, okay? On paper, running is, I'm pretty sure it's 60% based off this, of Hyrox's running. Now, editor Daniel will correct me if that's wrong. But especially when you take into account things like the rock zone, it obviously doesn't surprise us at all that they've said this. Now, one of the things that, again, I'm not too surprised at, is that the maximum heart rate people achieved in the study was during the exercise stations. So when you're running, obviously it's a repetitive movement. It's not necessarily steady state, but you are trying to be consistent. Things like your burpees, your heart rate can spike, things like your sled push, even the ski, that sort of thing. So to see the high heart rate there isn't too much of a surprise. Again, blood lactate, the max levels of lactate in the blood were after stations as well. So if you go from things like your sled push into your run, you'll think, whoa, my legs are a little bit jelly here. That's why. Scientifically, you're not wrong to think that. Okay. Now, the thing that I find interesting, this is the first thing in the study that actually surprised me, was that the highest values for people's maximum heart rate were usually found on the last station, the wall balls. Now, for me, I always assumed for me that it was the sled push, and I haven't actually looked at my heart rate data from Hyrox that much recently. But I suppose wall balls are full body movement, and at the end, you're obviously pretty knackered. So all of those things put together, maybe you're trying to put a bit of a sprint finish on as well. I don't know, did that surprise you? Let me know in the comments. But something that's interesting here is that the strongest correlation for performance in the sim was that those who had a higher VO2 max performed better. Now, that might sound, to those of you who know VO2 max, that might sound obvious, but at least we have that proved. Secondly, was endurance training volume. So those who did more endurance training volume had the characteristics of maybe performing better in their sim as well. And then after that was body fat percentage. And I suppose on that front, if you're leaner, some fat is going to be, mass you can't really use. So you want to be moving around functional mass as much as possible. Being too big will definitely be a limiting factor, because obviously when you're running, it's a lot harder to lug around 120 kilos than it is to lug around my little 65 kilo frame, okay? But they're the 3 strongest correlators to performance, but from these 11 people, worth noting. I would expect VO2 max would translate to a much larger demographic having a good correlation, but obviously it's worth bearing in mind. Now, using the results and what they measured, they basically determined that Hyrox can be classified as HIFT, which is high intensity functional training, okay? Now, there you go, more than 60% of total completion time was spent running. Boom, 60%, good maths. And it's a running focused form of functional training. We know this, okay? We don't need to go too much into that. Okay, so moving on from what Hyrox is classified as an event, we sort of already know that. We want to know how it's going to inform our training. But one more quick point that I find really interesting. We mentioned that there was a correlation between endurance training volume, VO2 max, to performance in the Hyrox. But on the flip side of that, they noted that strength was really not a correlation at all in terms of performance, which is an interesting thing to think about. So it just goes to show that you need that endurance training in there, because they said whilst strength was a determinator of performance in CrossFit, it's not in Hyrox as much, which does make sense. There's no max strength in there, but there does need to be an element of strength because you have to be able to move the sleds. If you can't move the sleds or pick up the kettlebells, then you can't finish the event, okay? Also worth noting that they use hand grip strength as their measure of strength, which obviously is less used, and it's 11 people, right? We don't necessarily know how strong they are compared to other people at normal lifts, if you like, all right? So when it comes to how it actually informs your training in the training recommendations section, sort of what we know, it recommends a broad training strategy. As I've always said, start your training broad, make sure you can do good technique, make sure you're good at running, then start running in a pre-fatigued state. Make sure you're, doing the stations when you're tired, because that's how it's going to be on the day, etc. You need to be used to coping for the level of lactate produced as well. Now, when it comes to actually doing these sessions, it does suggest that you split an endurance training session and a resistance training session to minimize interference. We call this the interference effect. If you have to do them both together, you do the one that's most important first. That's general rule of all of your training. But I fully appreciate it's not always going to be possible to get all resistance training sessions in and all endurance sessions in separately, because I appreciate you might be busy. So prioritize during your session. Now, this is also interesting. When it comes from your background, some of you might have come from strength into Hyrox, some of you might have come from endurance into Hyrox. If you came from strength into Hyrox, it suggests that you should take a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 ratio of resistance to endurance training. So either 1 and 1, or obviously more endurance than resistance. And if you need to get stronger, obviously it's vice versa. It's going to be a 2-to-1 ratio of resistance to endurance, or a 3-to-1 ratio. I'd lean more towards the 2-to-1 ratio, because you don't want too much resistance training, because it's mostly endurance still. One thing that is really interesting, based on their demographic again, all but one of the participants in the study, so 10 out of the 11, have good to excellent cardio levels, which is worth noting, because these might not be people that are complete beginners. As I say, they've done one before, but you don't really know how well they've done that before, okay? And we don't know their whole background. So they could have done really high level sport in their youth, for example. But yeah, it's worth noting with that and the small sample size, you have to take some of these findings with that in regard. But other than that, that's your study. Now, the main takeaways from this are that running is really important. Hyrox is predominantly a running event. Getting your VO2 max good is important as well. Endurance should be prioritized above strength. Make sure you can move the weights, but endurance should be your main focus. And yeah, that's really the main things that we know. It might justify some of your feelings in terms of how it feels, and they've got a scientific study about it. There needs to be more research before we were like, this is absolutely the only way you should train for Hyrox. But the good thing about fitness is that there's so many different ways to do it and so many different styles of training that you can do. Now, speaking of being good at Hyrox, if you watch this video, you likely want to be better at Hyrox, right? So what I've done is I've got 30 ways in the next 30 days that you're going to get 1 email a day completely for free of all the ways to get better at Hyrox. It explains station technique, it explains even what settings to have your watch on, that sort of thing. All of these things might help you in your next Hyrox. If you want it, you can just scan the QR code or hit the link below. I'll also link the whole article below so you can tell me if I've missed anything, because if I have, please do in the comments, because I've just been I had a brief look and highlighted some things before the video, but then I've just been going through it as I've been speaking to you now. Hopefully you found this helpful. I wouldn't say the study tells us anything crazy that we didn't already know, but it is nice to have some things confirmed. That's always good, especially as a coach. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one and have a lovely day.